Welcome to Mill Creek in Salem, Oregon. This is a small freshwater stream that's a tributary to the much larger Willamette River that flows directly into the Pacific Ocean. This river is fed by streams and snowmelt throughout the year and is an important part of the ecosystem in the Willamette Valley. This 26-mile stream is incredibly species-rich, but before we get into the invasive counterpart to this lesson, we must understand the native species that live here, such as the mountain whitefish, which is prevalent throughout the whole Northwest and is healthy food for larger mammals such as bears. Smaller sculpin that live under rocks and are ultimately food for larger fish. The signal crayfish, which is the only native crayfish throughout the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, as well as trout species such as brook, rainbow, brown, as well as all the algae and biofilm that you can see in the bottom right, that is also teeming with smaller insects that are food for fish. Say hello to the Pasiphasticus linisculus, or the signal crayfish. As the only native crayfish in Oregon, they can easily be told from other species from their white signal spots on their claws. And here's another image of the signal crayfish, but in more of a red hue. They can be found in brown, green, as well as red, which can be similar to other non-native species. This is a short video that I took of a young signal crayfish under some rocks in Mill Creek. They are often prey to larger fish, so this one is taking an aggressive stance against me. But they typically eat algae and other smaller biofilm under rocks, but larger species are also known to eat their young. Signal crayfish typically nest and live under large rocks where they eat and find housing against larger fish and birds. So what makes the signal crayfish so important, and why should you care about them? Other than being an integral part of the Louisiana cuisine, they're very important for the breakdown of nutrients in the environment. In this video, we can see a crayfish scurry along the bottom and process algae and biofilms, which get processed back into the water system through nitrogenous waste. Crayfish also make up a larger portion of large fish diet. The signal crayfish is not known to be a predatory species unless its other typical diet of detritus and algae have been exhausted, in which it will turn to cannibalism and eating small larval fish. Interestingly enough, the signal crayfish has become invasive in other parts of the world. Here's a video that I took of a larger crayfish that I found in Mill Creek that actually turned out to be a mother that was keeping some of her young under her tail. I quickly returned her back to the water and she was safe to go. Now that we've looked at Oregon's native crayfish, it's time to look at its invasive species, the rusty crayfish, or the Oconectus rusticus. It's easily identified by the rest mark on the sides of its carapace, but they can also be found with red tips on their claws. They can also be identified by small ovals on the insides of their claws once their pinchers are closed. As can be seen in this video, this species of crayfish is much more aggressive, which ultimately leads to them being able to push out native species and outcompete younger crayfish for food. Rusty crayfish also grow to much larger sizes. They are also much heavier grazers, which means that they cut down plants in the water system. The largest threat that this species imposes is that they feed on fish larvae and fish eggs, which has drastically cut down fish populations all throughout the U.S. where they have been established. Establishment of this crayfish species ultimately leads to fewer native species and lowered water. This guide was found at OregonFishAndWildlife.com, and other information similar to this can always be found at your local office or website. Rusty crayfish are native to Ohio, where they are able to be kept in check by other larger fish species such as bass. They have been spread throughout the U.S. because they are often used as bait for larger sport fish. Just like a lot of other invasives that are transported live, these crayfish often find their way back into the waterways when they are not used for bait. Total eradication is often incredibly hard, if not impossible, once the species is able to establish itself. Chemical input is often not an option because it's expensive and there's a possibility that it will kill native species as well. Some states have opted for putting more bass and sunfish into the water to help eat the smaller crayfish before they get to larger sizes. And while you can always eat the species, it's best to call your local Fish and Wildlife office and let them know you've found them.